church leader, a compliance officer, a husband, a father, the kind of man neighbors trusted without question, the kind you wouldn't look twice at. And then there was the name he gave himself: bind, torture, kill. Dennis Rader built a life that looked ordinary on purpose. Stable, structured, predictable. But underneath it, he was feeding something controlled, calculating, and patient. In the 1970s, in Wichita, Kansas, they were shaken by a series of brutal murders. The victims were chosen, watched, and studied long before he made contact. Families and women who lived all alone. People who never saw him coming. And then it just stopped. The killings ended, the messages stopped. Time passed, and the leads dried up. The case went cold. But Dennis Rader didn't disappear. He worked, went to church, raised his family, and built a life that made suspicion almost impossible. It was never just about the violence. It was always about control. And for decades, he'd held on to that control quietly until the silence wasn't enough anymore. Because eventually being forgotten becomes worse than being caught. So Dennis came back, and that decision cost him everything. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the truth finally catches up. Today's story is about control, and what happens when someone needs that control more than they need freedom. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 in Kansas into what looked like a completely ordinary working-class family. There was no chaos that stood out, no obvious warning signs that would make someone step in and say that something's wrong. On the surface, it was structured, stable, the kind of upbringing that blends into thousands of others. But inside that home, there was a different kind of absence. Rader would later describe his parents as emotionally distant. His mother worked long hours, his father was strict and not particularly engaged. There was discipline, but not connection. And for a child already wired differently, that gap mattered. Because it didn't start with violence, it started with his imagination. At a young age, Rader began developing fantasies that centered around control. Not just dominance, but total control. The kind where another person's fear, their restraint, and their helplessness became the focus. He was drawn to bondage at an early age, long before he even knew what it was. Fascinated by the idea of simply tying someone up and taking away their ability to move or escape. And instead of being interrupted, questioned, or redirected, all of those thoughts were allowed to grow. He never talked about it, though. He didn't act on it in a way that would immediately cause alarm at school. He just internalized it. And that internal world became detailed over time, more specific and more consuming. There were also early behaviors that, in hindsight, feel like warning signs. Rader admitted to acts of animal cruelty. He engaged in voyeurism. He watched others without their consent. He began stalking in very small, quiet ways, following, observing, and learning his community's routines. But from the outside, none of this really defined him. He was quiet, reserved, a rule follower, the kid who didn't bring any attention. And that's the part that made this stage of his life so unsettling. There were two versions of Dennis that were developing simultaneously, the one the world saw and the one that no one else did. And the hidden one was being reinforced through secrecy, through repetition, and the fact that nothing and no one had interrupted this progression. Each thought, each behavior, each private moment added another layer to something that was becoming more structured, more intentional. Because fantasy, once it's fed long enough without consequence, doesn't just stay a fantasy, it evolves. And for Rader, those early years weren't just a phase or a set of passing thoughts. They were the foundation, the place where control became the center of absolutely everything, where imagination stopped being harmless and started becoming something else entirely. It didn't start with murder. This started with the imagination of a small child. Now, as Dennis moved into early adulthood, those two versions did not separate. They became more organized. On the outside, his life flowed like a clear, structured path. He joined the U.S. Air Force, a decision that gave him discipline, routine, and a sense of order, things that he all valued. For most people, that environment actually reinforced his stability. But for Rader, it did something else. It gave structure to a mind that was already fixated on control. After he finished his service, he returned to Kansas and began building what looked like a conventional adult life. He got married. He had children. He settled into the kind of routine that signals reliability. It looked like he was doing everything right. But underneath that stability, the internal world he had been developing since childhood hadn't disappeared. It had become more deliberate. Rader didn't act randomly. He planned, he observed, and he practiced. He referred to all of these women he was obsessed with as projects, a word that stripped away their humanity and replaced it with a process. That language alone tells you what he was thinking. This wasn't about emotion. It wasn't his impulse. This was all methodical. He spent time stalking, watching people and their daily routines. Even people that he wasn't interested in causing harm to, he still watched them all the time. He was constantly testing boundaries. These were his rehearsals, his dry runs, moments where he would get close enough to feel the control without fully acting on it. And at the same time, the roles that he was choosing in his professional life only reinforced that need for authority. See, he got a job working installing security systems. This job is rooted in protection. He was entering people's homes, showing them how to stay safe and how to protect their space. It's almost a disturbing irony that the man who helped make people feel protected was the same man studying those same people for vulnerability. Later, he would become a compliance officer, a position that gave him direct power over others. He enforced rules, issued citations, dictated what people could and couldn't do. This was about control, and it was a legitimate control-based job. And that really defined this stage of his life. He wasn't chaotic, he wasn't spiraling. It was all structure, routine, and access. Everything about this environment allowed him to refine what had always been growing. The discipline of his lifestyle didn't suppress any of his impulses. It sharpened them, because Dennis wasn't losing control. He was perfecting it. By 1974, though, the line between fantasy and reality had finally been crossed. Dennis had spent years imagining, rehearsing, refining what control would look like. But when he acted, it didn't really unfold the way he envisioned. On January 15, 1974, he targeted the Otero family in Wichita, Kansas. Joseph Sr., 38, Julia, 33, and their children, Joey and Josephine, 9 and 11. Now, this wasn't an impulsive act. Rader had been watching them for 2 solid months. He had learned their routines, and that night he parked at a distance, climbed a fence, cut the phone lines before he approached the house, and waited until little Joey stepped outside to let the dog out. He then confronted Joey and forced himself in at gunpoint. At first, Joseph Sr. didn't really take him seriously, but Rader very quickly made it clear that this wasn't a joke. He claimed he was armed with a loaded .22 caliber pistol and told the family he was a wanted man, someone very dangerous. He ordered them all to lay onto the living room floor. From there, he separated the group, moving the women into the bedroom and binding them with rope that he brought with him. The entire scene carried the appearance of a robbery, and so the family responded as if that's what it was. They tried to cooperate. They explained they were uncomfortable being bound and just laid flat on the floor. Joseph Sr. mentioned prior injuries, saying the restraints were causing him pain, and Rader responded in a way that, on the surface, seemed considerate. He gave them pillows, adjusted their positions, as if he was going to make them more comfortable. Later, he would say that this was the moment when he decided he was going to kill them. Up until then, the situation had the shape of something else, a burglary, a threat, something that could end without violence. But in Dennis's mind, the purpose had shifted. Control was not enough anymore. And that's when the nightmare turned into something worse. He started with Joseph Sr., placing a plastic bag over his head. The first time, it failed. Joseph was able to bite through the plastic, disrupting Rader's attempt and forcing him to try again. The second time, though, he secured it more tightly and watched Joseph slowly suffocate. He then turned to Julia. He used a rope to strangle her, but it didn't go the way he expected. Strangulation takes a lot of time and strength, and during the process of trying to stab her, she regained consciousness, begging him to spare her children. That interruption, however, did not stop him. When he tried again, he made sure this time she didn't wake up. With Joey, Rader adjusted for his earlier mistake. He placed 2 bags over the little boy's head, ensuring there would be no chance of escape, and then watched him suffocate. Finally, Josephine was taken to the basement. He removed her clothing and tied a noose to a pipe overhead. At one point, he asked her if there was a camera in the house, as if he wanted to document what he had done. When she asked what was going to happen, he told her she would be in heaven with her family. He then hoisted Josephine into the air and masturbated while she struggled to survive. Afterward, he took the family's car and abandoned it at a local grocery store. But even then, the night wasn't over. He had to return to the Otero house to retrieve a knife he had left behind. For someone that had spent years building this moment up in his mind, he messed absolutely everything up. There were so many mistakes, interruptions, and adjustments. And that all mattered because it didn't stop him. He just realized that next time he had to do it better. What followed wasn't really an escalation in violence. It was the creation of an identity. See, Dennis Rader didn't just want to be another killer. He wanted a name. BTK. Bind, torture, and kill. Three words that reduced the human life into a process, a formula, his signature. And once that he had that identity, he needed it so that he could exist outside of himself. He began writing letters to the police, to the media. He described the crimes, inserted himself into the investigations, and demanded attention. These weren't confessions that were driven by guilt. They were performances. Because it wasn't just enough to kill, he needed to be seen. Now, the Wichita Eagle, a newspaper, got a letter from BTK labeled, "I did it," taking full responsibility for the Otero family murders. 3 brothers had actually already confessed to this murder, but Dennis made sure to leave in some details that had never been published publicly to let the police know that he was the real killer. In July, a man in Washington, D.C. was arrested for the murders, but he was cleared after fingerprint analysis. The Wichita Beacon would actually respond to these letters by running a classified ad that said, "BTK, help is available," and leaving a phone number. Dennis never called. As the murders continued, that need to be seen and acknowledged, it only grew stronger. He lasted 3 months before killing again. Kathleen Bright was 21 when she was attacked in her home, barely surviving. Dennis referred to this attack as Project Lights Out. He had been sloppy here too, because he didn't realize that Catherine had a 19-year-old brother living in the house with her. And on April 4th, 1974, he broke a glass sliding door and waited inside her home. He must have been nervous because he accidentally discharged his gun too, and that caused him to almost panic and abandon the killing because he was worried that when Catherine opened the door, she would smell the gunpowder. When both Catherine and her brother returned home, Dennis told them he was a wanted man from California and he needed money for food. Forced them into a bedroom and made Kevin tie up his sister and then tied Kevin up himself. Now this time he used household items that he'd found around the Bright house. He didn't want the police to connect him to the Otero murders. Not yet. He turned the radio up as loud as possible, and then when he went to kill Kevin, Kevin was free, and Kevin attacked him as soon as he walked through the door. This ended in a scuffle, and Kevin got shot in the forehead. Rader then tried to strangle Kevin on top of the shot, but that was also inefficient, and Kevin fought him back. He had to shoot Kevin 2 more times, once above his mouth, and then another simply grazed the side of his face. At this point, Kevin decided the best thing to do here was just play dead, and as soon as Dennis was out of the room, he ran and called the police from a neighbor's house. Dennis then immediately went to Catherine's room and tried to strangle her, but she started fighting him after he said he had shot and killed her brother. Rader kind of lost composure and began stabbing Catherine in the upper stomach area below her ribs. That was when Rader heard Kevin call for help again, and he just decided it was time to abandon ship. He stole Catherine's keys, but when her truck didn't start, he just ran away. When the police arrived, Catherine was alive and holding her phone, but she was unresponsive, and she died during emergency surgery. Kevin survived. But he didn't give enough information for the police to be able to find the man who killed his sister. Now, while Rader craved the attention from these murders, the disaster of the murder made him pause for about 3 years, actually. That is until he could deny the compulsion no longer, and on March 17th, 1977, he targeted 26-year-old Shirley Vian Relford. Dennis had actually planned to kill a completely different woman, but she wasn't home, so he just picked a random house on the block. This is one of those interesting moments in crime because part of Rader's pathology is that he had this intense need for control, but the need to kill was stronger. And so he actually, in this vein, risked capture to get the release from the act. Dennis would stand on the block and just kind of wait until he noticed a 5-year-old boy walking home. The little boy was Stephen Relford, and he would run out to grab soup for his mom who was sick. Dennis pretended to be an undercover detective and showed the boy a photo of his own wife and daughter. The little boy said, "That looks like my mom and sister," and so Dennis followed him home. Inside the Relford house, he kept up the detective ruse. He asked the family about the photo, and when Shirley was looking, Dennis pulled his gun out. He told her he was a wanted man and she was being robbed. And just like before, Dennis struggled to properly secure his victims. He tried to tie up the children, but they were too wiggly. So he ended up forcing them into a bathroom and then barricading the door. He actually made Shirley help him barricade them in. But before he locked the door, he did give the children their toys, and then he went to go kill their mother. He strangled Shirley after covering her head with 2 plastic bags, and Dennis said that he originally intended to kill the children too, but the phone rang, and one of the children in the bathroom yelled, "That's someone coming to visit us." And so Dennis ran away. He decided that next time he would get it right. And so this time Dennis spent more time stalking his next victim, Nancy Jo Fox. He waited until December 8th, 1977 to execute Project Fox Hunt, as he called it. That night, he broke into her house through a back window and waited for her to return home from work. When Nancy found him in her home, she actually began screaming, full voice, to get out and threatening that she was going to call the police. Rader told her he'd already cut the phone lines and very calmly told her he was going to bind her, take photographs, and that he was going to rape her. Rader undressed himself and allowed Nancy to undress in the bathroom. How polite. She resisted, and Dennis decided to handcuff her instead. He didn't actually rape her. He actually kind of sat on top of her, and he used his belt to slowly choke her, releasing the pressure enough that she would wake up, and then he would choke her until she passed out again. He never admitted how many times he did this, but the following morning, he called the police from a phone booth and told them that they could find Nancy's remains in her home. That call would be released in 1979, but it never actually led to any real arrests. January 31st, 1978, Rader sent a bizarre letter to a local classified department of the Wichita Beacon. It contained a poem he wrote that began, "Shirley Lux, Shirley Lux." And then it went into explicit details of how he murdered Shirley Relford. 1 month later, on February 10th, he sent another letter to the Wichita TV station KAKE, Keek, and took responsibility for the O'Terra murders, as well as Bright, Relford, and Fox. This letter was important to the investigation because Rader asked, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" Very clearly detailing his compulsive need for attention. He also took time with this letter to compare himself to Jack the Ripper, Son of Sam, and the Hillside Stranglers. He wrote another poem titled "Death to Nancy." He told the police to send him a hidden message. The police instead traced the letter to Wichita State University, where Dennis was a student. BTK wasn't a nickname that was given by the public. It was something that he created, something he fed, and something that Dennis needed. Every letter, every message, and every taunt was part of him constructing this identity. Because the act of killing people was only part of it. He needed that recognition. And as long as he was being watched, talked about, and chased, he was getting exactly what he wanted. Dennis tried to kill again in April of 1979. This time his target was 63-year-old Anna Williams. Just like with Nancy, he stalked her for months, preparing his attack and approach, even breaking in ahead of time and stealing from her. The break-in actually caused Anna to hire a security company, and while we don't know if Dennis installed her specific system, we do know that he worked for ADT, and he used his job to spy on his victims. The night that he broke into Anna's home, he was confident that he knew her routine, but Anna had been invited out by her friends to go square dancing, and she stayed out late. Dennis waited in her home for hours, and frustrated, went home and penned the poem, "Oh, Anna, why didn't you appear?" He dropped that letter off at Anna's house, And inside of the envelope included the drawing of a nude woman tied up, and then he added in a scarf and 2 plastic hair clips. The scarf and the clips had belonged to Anna, and they had been stolen during the earlier break-in. He delivered that letter to her in June. The police wouldn't hear from BTK again until 1988. After 77, the violence stopped, as far as the police knew. There were no new bodies, no new messages, no signs of BTK. For investigators, it felt like the case had simply gone quiet. Another killer who disappeared without explanation. This wasn't anything new. Maybe he'd moved to another part of the country. Maybe he died. Maybe he lost his nerve. But Dennis didn't disappear. He settled in. This is the part of the story that's easy to misunderstand because on the surface it looks like restraint, like something inside of him shut down. But nothing about Rader suggests he suddenly became a different person. If anything, he became more controlled. There are a few ways we can explain the lull. His children were growing up. His responsibilities were expanding. A stable home life requires time, attention, and consistency. It's possible that maintaining that image just became his priority. It was more important to him that people saw him as the everyman, the everybody's dad. There's also the question of fear. By the late 70s, law enforcement was paying attention. His letters had drawn focus. The risk was real, and let's be real, his prior murders had not been clean and easy. He had left behind a lot of DNA evidence, and even though we weren't in a state of technological advancement to do anything with that evidence, all it would take was one mistake, and he would be caught and humiliated. But for someone like Rader, stopping doesn't necessarily mean they lose the urge. If we follow Robert Ressler and John Douglas's FBI profiling system, Dennis would be classified as a classic organized serial killer. And nothing about this subset of individuals is impulsive. Everything is about constant routine, control, controlling the crime scene, maintaining your social focus, and above all else, patience. Organized killers are known to have very long cooldown periods. And Rader is not the first killer of his kind to suppress his urge for years. For Dennis, those years of suppression were focused on him building an almost untouchable social reputation and image. He was the church president. He was a Boy Scout leader, a city compliance officer, positions that all signaled trust, authority, and good moral standing. The kind of roles that don't just blend into your community, they actually anchor you into it. He was the dependable neighbor, never BTK. That same person who had committed those murders was now enforcing the rules, mentoring children, and leading people spiritually within his church. Not as a cover in the traditional sense, but this was a fully integrated aspect of his identity. This isn't what you would call a fracture, like other killers we've discussed over the years who might be suffering from multiple personality disorder. Dennis just had 2 sides to himself who he could flip between very easily, and he was fully cognizant of both aspects of his identity. The father and the killer. They were all parts of the same man. He had combined these identities and he learned how to control both. Whatever existed in those earlier years hadn't disappeared. He had contained it. Dennis Rader didn't stop being BTK. He got better at hiding him. Now, as the murder stopped, the investigation didn't. Law enforcement in Wichita formed what became known as the BTK Task Force, a dedicated group focused on identifying a killer who had already shown he was methodical, patient, and capable of disappearing. They weren't dealing with someone reckless. They were dealing with a person who could blend in, and that made their job exponentially harder. In the 1970s, the tools we think of today simply didn't exist. No modern DNA profiling, no national database to instantly cross-reference evidence. Investigators relied on physical evidence, witness statements, and behavior patterns, all of which only go so far when the offender doesn't leave much behind. And DNA only matters if you can actually compare it to a person. So the fact that he had left behind so much DNA didn't mean anything. And despite all of the early mishaps, Rader was still careful. He was actually quite meticulous in cleaning his crime scenes. He didn't leave any obvious connections between his victims. There were no clear suspects who stood out. Instead, there was just this growing list of possibility. Hundreds of names that became thousands. Men who lived in the area, men with criminal records, men who seemed just a little bit weird. But nothing that definitively ever pointed to just one person. And at the same time, the case had another problem: time. As the years passed without any new murders or communication, public fear began to fade. What had once felt immediate and urgent just became distant. People moved on, leads went cold, resources shifted. And for investigators, that creates a different kind of pressure. Because the longer a case sits without movement, the harder it will be to revive. Witness memories fade, evidence degrades, momentum disappears. But the task force never stopped. They reviewed files, revisited evidence, followed leads that continued to go nowhere, tried to build a profile of someone who, by all accounts, had simply vanished. And that was the problem. They weren't chasing somebody on the run. They were hunting a ghost that had just decided to stand still. Dennis wasn't running. He was living his life exactly the way he always had been. And as long as he stayed quiet, there was never anything that would pull him back into the light. After 6 years of silence, though, Dennis killed again. Maureen Hedge, whom Rader called Project Cookie. She lived just a few houses down from him. He chose her for a specific reason. He wanted to see if he could kill one of his neighbors and get away with it. On April 27, 1985, Rader created an alibi. He left a Cub Scouts outing early, feigning sickness, changed his clothes, stopped at a bar to make himself appear intoxicated, and he even called a taxi and used a fake slurred voice so he could be dropped off near his neighborhood without any suspicion. He cut Hedge's phone line, broke into her home, and hid in her closet. When she returned with her boyfriend, he waited. Only after the boyfriend left and Maureen went to bed did Dennis make his move. He startled her awake, subdued her, and strangled her. But for Rader, the killing wasn't the end here. He took her body to his church, a place where he had the keys and privacy. There he staged her body and took photographs, turning the scene into part of his fantasy. Before morning, he cleaned everything up, removed her body, and later dumped it in a remote area. Days later, her car was found abandoned, and shortly after that, her body was recovered 7 miles away from home. His next murder was Vicki Weggerl. At the time, Rader was still working for ADT, and while on the job, he noticed 28-year-old Vicki and began watching her, later calling her Project Piano. On September 16, 1986, he used his job as a disguise, wearing a hard hat and posing as a phone technician. He first entered a neighbor's home to make his presence seem legitimate, and then he went to Vicki. Once inside, he made small talk while pretending he was checking her phone line. Then he pulled a gun and forced her into the bedroom. Vicki fought back. She actually managed to break free from the original bindings, and she scratched his face hard enough that he later admitted that mark scarred. The struggle, along with the barking dogs and open windows, made Rader very nervous, and he knew his time was limited. Even so, he couldn't stop. He had to finish the ritual. After killing her, he took photos of her body before driving away in her car. He actually passed her husband on the way away from her home, and then abandoned the vehicle nearby and returned home. For years, Vicki's husband was the number one suspect. It wouldn't be until nearly 2 decades later that Rader finally admitted the truth in 2004. At the time, her case was actually unconnected, another tragedy without a clear answer. But even in silence, Rader wasn't disconnected from violence. In January of 1988, there was a woman named Mary Fager, and she received an envelope postmarked January 5th, and inside was a poem titled, "Oh God, He Put Kelly Sherry in the Tub," along with a disturbing drawing of a bound young girl near a pool. Just days earlier, Mary's husband, Melvin, and her 2 daughters had been murdered in their home. The details were horrific, and it absolutely matched the poem. But Rader was never actually linked to those killings, and he never claimed responsibility. He just inserted himself because he wanted to be a part of the investigation. He referenced the crime, he wrote about it, created his own version of the scene. It wasn't accurate, but it still caused a lot of trauma for Mary Fager. It was like he was observing, analyzing, and responding from a distance. He actually later described admiration for this killer, saying, "Another one prowls the deep abyss of lewd thoughts and deeds." Even without committing an act, he wanted proximity to it. and then he went quiet for another few years. His last and final murder was 1991. He targeted 62-year-old Dolores Davis after watching her near her home, referring to her as Project Dogside. He had been casing her house for quite some time, waiting for the right moment. Finally, on January 18th, he created another alibi. Similar to before, he left a Boy Scout outing early, changed clothes, made his way to her home on foot through fields and a cemetery. The cold pushed him to act quickly, and instead of quietly entering, he just broke in. He waited until Davis went to bed and then forced his way inside her room. At first, he told her he was going to tie her up and take her car. She resisted, and when he threatened her with weapons, she decided to comply. He ransacked the kitchen to maintain the illusion of a robbery. But when Dolores started pleading for her life, he just strangled her. Now, initially, Dennis intended to stay longer with Dolores's body, but he had to leave sooner than expected. He moved her body, drove it to a remote area, and abandoned it. Then he returned to her house to clean up parts of the scene and reestablish his alibi before anyone had noticed he was gone. Weeks later, they found her body under a bridge. And then, just like before, it stopped. No communication, no activity that law enforcement could tie back to BTK, and the cases just sat. The name BTK faded. The fear that once gripped Wichita slowly dissolved into something more distant. But silence, for someone like Dennis Rader, it's not permanent. Because being forgotten becomes its own kind of pressure. And in 2004, that pressure broke. It started on March 19th, 2004. The Wichita Eagle received a letter from someone named Bill Thomas Killman, a moniker, and it took credit for Vicki Wegel's murder. He included photographs from the scene and a copy of Vicki's driver's license. Before this moment, police had never known that Vicki was killed by BTK. Now, what Dennis didn't realize was that in 2004, there was new evidence and new technology. Vicki had DNA under her nails from where she scratched him, and the police began to DNA test hundreds of men in the region. Professors, police officers, anybody who was in a position of power. And in the end, they ended up doing 1,300 tests. The samples were court-ordered to be destroyed after eliminating a suspect. They may not have found BTK, but they knew they had his DNA, and they could link it to all of his past crimes. In May of 2004, KAKE received a letter with chapter headings for the BTK story. It came also with fake IDs and a word puzzle. On June 9th, graphic images of the Otero murders were found taped to a stop sign at the corner of First and Kansas roads in Wichita. It also included a sketch labeled "The Sexual Thrill Is My Bill." And there were more chapter headings for this unwritten book that he decided would be called the BTK story. This sort of story he wrote about himself was very similar to a 1999 story that had been written about him by a court TV writer named David Lohr. So apparently BTK said, "You did a good job, but here, let me fix this." In July, a package was dropped in a return slot at the local public library. That took credit for a suicide in Argonia, Kansas. Police weren't sure if this was a copycat or Dennis just playing mind games with them. In all of these correspondences, he gave entirely too much personal information about himself. He told them he was former military. He told them he loved trains. He did try to mislead them by saying he'd been born in 1939. But what the police didn't know was that Dennis was trying to kind of rally himself to get ready for another kill. He'd actually set a date in October of 2004. He was in the process of stalking his next victim, and he wanted people to remember the fear of the 70s when he started up again. We don't know why he didn't go through with it. Instead, though, he continued his campaign with the local media. In the month of October, he dropped a manila envelope in a UPS box with cards of images of just horrible violence against women. And he also had drawings he did himself of children in bondage. It also contained a threatening poem about the lead investigator, Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, and a fake autobiography about his life. Then in December, police found another package at the local Murdoch Park that had Nancy Fox's driver's license and had a doll that was bound at the hands and feet with a small plastic bag over the doll's head. Then in January of 2005, Dennis left a cereal box in the bed of a pickup truck at Home Depot, and when the owners saw it, he immediately threw it in the trash. Dennis had to write a letter to the police asking, "So you guys didn't get my new package?" And telling them where he had left it, and the police had to go recover the items from the garbage. Surveillance videos showed a figure in a black Jeep Cherokee leaving the box, but old school CCTV was pretty bad, so they couldn't see his license plate or really any details on his face. In February, he sent more cards to Cake and another cereal box with a doll inside of it. Then Dennis made a mistake. In one of his letters, he asked the police a simple question: "Can a floppy disk be traced?" Investigators saw an opportunity. They responded through a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle telling him it would be safe. One line: "Rex, it'll be okay." And Dennis believed them. On February 16, 2005, Rader sent a purple Memorex floppy disk to a local TV station with a letter, a fake gold necklace, and a photocopy of a book titled Rules of Prey. It was another attempt to insert himself into the story, another way to be seen. But this time he had gone too far. Because what Rader didn't understand, or maybe he just chose to ignore, was that that disk held more than just the files he intended to send. It held information about him. The metadata they pulled from the disk led investigators to Christ Lutheran Church. And a simple Google search showed that only one man at the church was named Dennis. And Dennis had edited a file that was on that floppy drive. This man who had spent decades controlling every little detail had just handed himself over to the police, and he didn't even realize it. Surveillance would follow, and police felt very confident after seeing the black Jeep Cherokee that they had the right guy. The problem was, this is still circumstantial evidence. Okay, we have the floppy drive that has a man named Dennis who works at the church editing the file. And yeah, Dennis does drive the same car that we saw drop off that cereal box. But it wasn't enough. Police decided to do something unique at the time. They obtained a search warrant to analyze a pap smear sample from Dennis Rader's daughter. She'd gotten her pap smear when she was in school at Kansas State University. They got that information from the medical clinic. DNA testing revealed there was a familial match between the sample and the DNA recovered from under Vicki Weggerl's nails. The result indicated that the killer was a close relative of Dennis Rader's daughter. And when combined with the other evidence, it gave investigators enough to move forward with an arrest. Dennis Rader was arrested while driving near his home on February 25, 2005. An officer asked him, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" And he replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." Now, on February 28, 2005, Dennis was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. It was rumored that during interrogation he confessed to other murders, but the DA chose to go with cases they had direct DNA evidence to convict. The DA would later say that this was not true, but it does kind of follow how most DAs work. You want the confirmed kill, not potentially others that would make the case more confusing. Interestingly enough, Dennis was particularly worried about the death penalty, and he was also worried about general population in prison. He specifically said he didn't want to be with the loonies in Gen Pop, as if he's not one of the loonies. On March 1st, his bail was set at $1 million, and then on March 3rd, a not guilty plea was submitted on his behalf because he stood in court and refused to say anything. Then on June 27th, he decided to change his plea to guilty. That, coincidentally, was the first day of his pretrial hearing. So, in order for them to want to work with him, they said, "You need to stand in front of us and tell us everything." So he did. Dennis stood in court. There was no breakdown, no visible remorse, no moment where the weight of all he had done seemed to catch up with him. Instead, he spoke. He was calm, clear, and in detail. He waived his right to a trial, and he delivered a full confession, walking through each murder as if he were recounting a simple series of tasks. He used his own language, his own structure, referring back to the same patterns he had developed years earlier. Binding, strangulation, control, no hesitation. No emotional shift as he talked about the victims, not even the children. No acknowledgement of the lives he had taken beyond the mechanics of how he did it. At times, it sounded like a confession, and other times, a report. In fact, sometimes when the DA asked him questions, He corrected details, clarified the timelines, added information that only he would know, not to express his guilt, but to make sure the story was accurate and complete. Because even then, he was still trying to control the narrative. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom and listened as he described their loved ones' final moments with the same tone someone might use to just explain taking the trash out. And that's what made it so unsettling. There was no distance from this for him. He was never overwhelmed by what he had done. He was reliving it in court in front of the families of his victims. And in that moment, the same need that drove him to write those letters, to name himself, to come back after decades of silence, it was still there. He needed to be heard. He needed to be understood and to make sure that nobody got his story wrong. Sorry. On June 27th, 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Even then, though, the control he chased for decades, it didn't fully disappear. Remember, he didn't confess over guilt. He wanted to be heard. And as he was being transported to El Dorado Correctional Facility, it was just a regular day for him. The contrast actually was striking. During the drive, the driver said he made small talk about the weather as if nothing had changed in his life. But then, as they were listening to the radio as they were driving to the prison, the victim impact statements played over the radio. And Dennis cried. Not in the courtroom, not while he confessed, but there in private. And then the door closed on his cell. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, a status that will probably remain for the rest of his life. He was removed from the public, separated from other inmates, stripped of the environment that he had control over. But that doesn't mean that the need for control ever disappeared. It just adapted. In prison, he continued to seek out attention in whatever ways were available to him. He was corresponding with outsiders, talking to his fans, and warned by prison officials about these ongoing communications that he was crossing lines. At one point, he was granted limited privileges for good behavior, access to a TV, books, and art supplies. Even that, though, sparked concern, with prosecutors arguing that exposure to media and imagery could actually allow him to relive his crimes. Essentially, if you guys give him crayons and pencils, he's going to draw his murders again. And they had a good point, because for Dennis Rader, the story never really ends. It just changes form for him. There are even reports of him setting rules for how people can contact him, conditions and boundaries, requirements, even now in a prison cell, attempting to dictate the terms of interaction, reinforcing the same pattern that defined his life outside these walls: control over access, control over communication, control over how he is being perceived. And outside the prison, the fascination still hasn't gone away. Profilers study him, his behavior, his communication, his psychology. His name continues to surface in discussions about criminal profiling and the evolution of serial offenders. Books have been written, interviews have been given. His story is revisited again and again in podcasts like these. Even his home family has had to confront this reality. His daughter, Carrie Rawson, has spoken publicly about the impossible task of reconciling the father she knew with the man she now understands him to be. A childhood that felt normal, reframed by something hidden in plain sight. For years, Carrie tried to find a path forward. She spoke about forgiveness, about faith, about trying to make sense of it. But that changed. In 2021, she made the decision to cut off contact with her father. What she had learned, what she had uncovered, made any relationship impossible to maintain. As investigators revisited old evidence, they found journals Rader had kept, detailed coded records of his thoughts and actions. Carrie helped decode parts of them, and what surfaced was deeply personal. One entry read, Carrie /BND /game 1981. BND was Dennis's shorthand for bondage. And in 1981, Carrie was a toddler. In October of 2023, she confronted him in prison, face to face, and what followed was not accountability. I sat feet across from you. You crumpled up, rotting away in a wheelchair, me standing tall and brave, and confronted you with the hard, bare truth. you had kept hidden from me for over 4 decades. You denied it, gaslit me, emotionally and verbally abused me, and asked me what PTSD is. And then when I explained it, told me I had brought this all on myself. Even then, faced with all the information, he refused to admit what he had done to Carrie. And at the same time, investigators in Osage County have continued examining hundreds of drawings and writings recovered from Rader's home in 2005, hoping they may connect him to additional crimes, including the 1976 disappearance of Cynthia Kenny. But Dennis remains silent. And in that silence, the pattern continues. Because even now, control is the one thing he refuses to give up. It's the one thing that no one can take from him. The truth. And it's still sitting exactly where he wants it. The odds are that he has actually committed more crimes, but he has absolutely no intention of telling us anything about it. Dennis intends to die with that truth. Dennis Rader didn't look like a monster. That's the part that usually stays with people. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't disconnected from society. He was a part of it, a neighbor, a coworker, a man trusted to enforce the rules, to lead and to protect people. And all the while, there was someone else living beneath the surface. That's why we keep talking about him. That's what makes this all so unsettling. Because it forces you to confront the reality that most people don't want to accept. Someone can appear completely normal, completely ordinary, and still be capable of extraordinary harm. In the end, it wasn't the crimes that brought Dennis Rader down. It was his ego. The same need that pushed him to name himself, to write those letters, to insert himself into other investigations. It's all what exposed him. The media gave him a platform, and after a long time, he used it exactly the way he wanted to, until it became a trap. Because the more he reached out, the more he needed to be recognized, the more he revealed, piece by piece, detail by detail, until there was enough information to find him. And at the center of all this was control. Dennis wanted to control his victims, control his image, control over when he would appear and when he would disappear. But control for Dennis wasn't just a desire, it was an addiction. And like many addictions, it eventually cost him everything. What he wanted the most, to be seen, it's what led him to get caught. And once that happened, the version of himself he spent decades building collapsed, leaving behind not a mystery, but a man, a very real human man, who chose over and over again to be something else. Because the truth is, Dennis Rader didn't just hide in plain sight, he depended on it. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been another episode of When Killers Get Caught. And remember, the truth always leaves a trail.